Cyberwork listeners, I have important news before we dive into today's episode. I want to make sure you all know that we have a lot more than weekly interviews about cybersecurity careers to offer you. You can actually learn cybersecurity for free on our Infosec skills platform. If you go to infosecinstitute.com/free and create an account, you can start learning right now. We have 10 free cybersecurity foundation courses from podcast guest Keitron Evans, 6 cybersecurity leadership courses from also podcast guest Cicero Chimbanda, 11 courses on digital forensics, 11 courses on incident response, 7 courses on security architecture, plus courses on DevSecOps, Python for cybersecurity, JavaScript security, ICS and SCADA security fundamentals, and more. Just go to infosecinstitute.com/free and start learning today. Got it? Then let's begin today's episode. Today on Cyberwork, my guest is Marcus Fowler, Senior Vice President of Strategic Engagement and Threats at DarkTrace. In today's episode, we talk about attack vectors currently facing embedded journalists, their need to be available at all times for potential sources, and how that openness makes them, their company, and their confidential sources potential attack vectors for cybercriminals. Marcus talks about security hardening strategies that don't compromise journalistic availability, the work of threat research, and why people with a natural interest in cybersecurity will have their career path choose them and not the other way around. That's all today on Cyberwork. Welcome to this week's episode of the Cyberwork with Infosec podcast. Each week, we talk with a different industry thought leader about cybersecurity trends, the way those trends affect the work of Infosec professionals, and offer tips for breaking in or moving up the ladder in the cybersecurity industry. Our guest today, Marcus Fowler, spent 15 years at the Central Intelligence Agency, developing global cyber operations and technical strategies until joining DarkTrace in 2019. He has led the cyber efforts with various U.S. intelligence community elements and global partners and has extensive experience advising senior leaders on cyber efforts. He's recognized as a leader in developing and deploying innovative cyber solutions. Prior to serving at the CIA, Marcus was also an officer in the United States Marine Corps. Marcus has an engineering degree from the United States Naval Academy and a master's degree in international security studies from the Fletcher School. He also completed Harvard Business School's Executive Education Advanced Management Program. So today's topic was Marcus pitched it to me. We're going to talk about specifically about cyber criminals and using, I believe, media and media sources in other countries as attack vectors. And I'm sure we'll get into some other stuff as well, but that's sort of the umbrella today. So Marcus, thank you for joining me today. Welcome to Cyberwork.
Oh, Chris, it's fantastic to be here. I really appreciate it. It is an honor.
Pleasure. Pleasure is all mine. So I always like to reset the room. I mean, we got a nice bio from you here, but what first got you interested in computers and tech, and where did you first get excited about cybersecurity? Was it when you were at the CIA? Was it before that? Were you sort of on the command line since you were a child?
So I'm probably a late arrival to the cyber world. You know, I engineering degree, but then in the Marine Corps, I was like a combat engineer, which means I either built things or I blew them up, kind of a C4 or 2x4 type of role. And then, grad school, I took a really interesting class around technology and national security that started to really get me there. And then it wasn't until I was at the CIA and I really started to see the impact of what emerging and next generation technologies and their application by our adversaries, and specifically around terrorist use of the internet, because this was back in, 2007, 2008, where really seeing that area as one of concern, but also one of what we weren't, in my opinion, taking the greatest advantage of that we could have. And that kind of took me down a path of really learning more about the digital cyber technology space, how we were leveraging it from data correlation and geolocation to offensive cyber operations and intelligence collection and those type of things. And I very much gravitated towards wanting to be a person who could take the teams that were developing these emerging, amazing technologies and help translate them to the mission impact of national security leaders that maybe didn't have that same level of certainly not expertise, but even comfort in how the translation, how they were thinking about resourcing, prioritizing, and at the same time, kind of the reverse of that path of talking to those technical teams about what direction we should be thinking about the technology to have the greatest mission impact. Because what you could have is, you could have a technical team that creates something amazing and it's groundbreaking, but if it doesn't matter to mission or it doesn't matter to business, then it's just a shiny toy that a lot of money was spent on, no matter how innovative it is, right? And if and the same impact for the business leader, if they aren't, they might have all sorts of mission problems that really are perfect for an emerging or next generation technology, AI, machine learning, that if they're not leveraging, they're operating in kind of a substandard place.
Okay. So how much of the security that you learned doing this work with the CIA was sort of on the job? I mean, were you just kind of thrown in the deep end and sort of learned it as you went? Like, how fast was the ramp up time in this case? It
was very much on the job and grabbing the time of experts in their fields that I knew I needed to utilize and to leverage. I did have to, there was probably a choice at some point where either I could like take a direction where I was going to try and be the expert, or I was going to be the informed voice and champion with the expert beside me in order to do it. And that just gravitated more for me and more for being able to have a quick mission impact. So it really was, but also being a very active kind of question asker and engaging, like, hey, I see that you said, we could go this direction. Well, why is that? What's happening there? Let me understand more about your decision-making. Like, and because there's always some conversation in technology that doesn't require you to be able to know how to write the Python script to understand the value of the effort put in and how it could be leveraged by various elements of an organization.
Yeah, there's the practical end, there's the theoretical end, there's the direct technical end, and all of those are needed, and you don't necessarily need to be the greatest of all time in all three of them to sort of throw your hands into the work.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, as you said, following your time at the CIA, you joined DarkTrace as the director of strategic threat before moving up to SVP of strategic engagements and threats. So can you talk about what precipitated this move from the federal or military sector into the private sector and how your skills sort of moved across, if there was a big culture shift or a big, another sort of, having to relearn things from the beginning aspect to it?
Absolutely. I can share you with how I think each journey for anybody that does that transition is different. And certainly for me, I love the CIA. There's amazing men and women that are doing fantastic work there. So it had nothing to do with needing to leave government or leave the CIA. But I had gotten to a point in my career, and I'd never been in the private sector. I mean, I went at 19, I was at the Naval Academy, and I stayed in the military and or some version of service up until 2019. And for me, I just really wanted to understand. I came to that fork in the road where either I was going to stay until retirement, right, for the federal service, or I was going to pivot. I was going to have a next act in the play, right?
You could feel that this was the moment.
Right, to evaluate, right? It wasn't even like a sure thing. It was more like, all right, I'm going to take a very good look at what's out there. And I probably spent about a year. I probably talked to 20 plus companies ranging from data science work, cybersecurity work, threat intel, cyber threat intel work, and trying to, and I took any call, because every call that I had was kind of, there were two pieces of it that were critical to me. One was, why did this person choose to take this call with me, and what in my background is resonating with them?
Right. And
the other is, what are they saying that resonates or doesn't resonate with me, and I'm starting to kind of form where I wanted to land, or where I thought I wanted to land. Because, it's one thing to be a lawyer in the public sector and go be a lawyer in the private sector, right? That's fairly direct. It's another to be like an intelligence officer and an other, right? So I knew it was going to have to be a fairly dramatic pivot from a experience standpoint. I did have from my time at doing the Harvard doing HBS's executive education program, I did have some confidence that my skills were sought after at the C-suite, right? Because I think that's the biggest thing, right? Is you got to know that there's a place out there for you, right? Or at least some interest, right, in having it. And then it just was a matter of finding the right fit.
Yeah. And I'm glad you expounded on that. We have an awful lot of people in the military and veterans who are reskilling or looking to change, who are taking our classes. And so there's an awful lot of public sector to private sector pivoting, and what do I do next, and how do I take these skills and convert them into that? So I think the importance of those kind of personal stories is always really, really helpful to us and to our listeners. So can you talk about some of the common day-to-day tasks, roles, responsibilities you have at DarkTrace, and especially how those roles have changed or gotten larger with the title upgrade?
Sure. Yeah. And it really has kind of been an evolving kind of role, I think. So initially, and to some extent, still my main focus has been and you kind of always hear it in my new title of engagements and threats. So on the threat side, emerging next generation, what's happening? How are we thinking about the threat space, nation state, non-nation state actors? I had the pleasure of doing, a webinar earlier today, talking Russia, Ukraine, cyber impact, longer term. That, those are the type of things that I like to kind of pull on both my nation state activity kind of experience, as well as kind of where we're seeing some of our own trends through the DarkTrace lens, through our own kind of SOC efforts and those types of things. So that was a big area. And then also the executive sponsor business engagement role of being able to talk about strategic value, strategic impact, taking that, amazing emerging or next generation technology and talking to the senior leader at that C-suite level, where you're really talking about business, what matters to business operations, business need, with that security as the through line, or security decision-making and risk being it. So that really was kind of the main core areas that I was initially brought on. Okay. Where I have kind of evolved or expanded a bit is, one, I've gotten very interested in the strategy aspects behind the scenes of how we're thinking about using people like me, or how they are being employed to assist their broader DarkTrace community or the industry engagement, and how what we can do intentionally around that from a resource efficiency, but also, making sure that we're out there as the resource when needed. The other is some of the other bigger programs, like DarkTrace just announced its launch of its federal division just within the last week and a half. So obviously that's a massive endeavor in terms of trying to think about how you move into that space, or how you want to what role you want to play in that space. So I've been very active in time of bringing together the right resources for that division to be successful and play a role in assisting more directly in national security.
Okay, so I think you kind of answered this, but I'll ask anyway. But whenever I get to talk to a C-suite person, I'm always curious about the time split between the work of dealing with clients, working sort of C-suite to C-suite or at upper level things, versus the time you used to spend kind of getting your hands dirty researching threats or doing this. Are you able to find a balance? Are you fine with sort of leaving some of the sort of like hands-on work behind, or do you not leave? Do you still sort of engage in threat research and so forth as well on an active level? So
prioritization of what I do in my day is key, because I know I can't do everything. And one of the things certainly that I don't get to do as much as I'd like is some of that research. I do leverage I certainly have the people that I know are doing it day to day. And so we'll have a Teams chat going. We'll throw some threads around of, hey, why do how interesting that the Conti ransomware group aligned with Russia, or what do we think about their implosion? And we'll all kind of kick around ideas, do some research, think about that. So, that is very much, something that you're always kind of trying to get a little bit more, but also the other aspects of life, I'm a father and a husband. You can't do it all the time, but I think it is. I do enjoy that resource aspect. I also like kind of being out there trying to get these projects moving forward and internal communication, but also external. I mean, some of my favorite things is moderating executive roundtables or, fireside chat with a DarkTrace customer. They get to kind of hear the impact, hear the use.
Yep.
Those are always some of my kind of favorite engagements. I'm actually, have the honor of being the co-chair of our CXO council. So I get to have these great deep dive sessions with, senior security leaders from across industries, across the kind of DarkTrace landscape, and just love to hear kind of what they're dealing with and how their crosstalk happens, right? How they're sharing and getting stronger from best practices and strategies. Because I think security is one area where almost everybody wants to share and discuss and get better, right? Very few see it as a true competitive advantage if my security is better than your security. I mean, that isn't less so maybe for some of us that are vendors in the security space, but across the industries, there's really that checking brand at the door a bit because they all know they're in the same fight. And so it is a place where you want to share.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you have a lot of sort of cross company collaboration then in that regard with what would otherwise be competitors?
Wherever we can. I think wherever it makes sense. I think as you think about the security ecosystem environment, those that are value enablers, value collaborators are going to be the best in breed, right? You can't, you're not going to force a security team to throw everything they have in the trash and assimilate to the Borg of DarkTrace or another platform, right? It needs to be. You need to be brought on as something that is, a positive gain. It is a collaborator with things you're already doing in your workflow. Now, I think over time you might say, okay, this level of overlap is very positive and good, and I like it. This level of overlap, there's probably redundancy here. Let me reevaluate, where I'm using what, right? So, but I think coming from an open integration, open API standpoint, the perfect example is, we have DarkTrace for the endpoint, but I also integrate with CrowdStrike, right? Because, they're a more robust EDR. We're doing some other, there's some augmenting niche differences, but enough that I also don't want, if you have CrowdStrike, I need to be able to see that telemetry. Like DarkTrace overall is going to be stronger for the availability of that intel, for the AI and machine learning to be positioned wherever it can to have that defensive superiority. So I think that's the approach niche one-off solutions that don't talk with anything. You have to go to another, pane of glass. It really are more cumbersome very often than they're worth for a lot of security teams.
Yeah, I believe that. So I want to get into our main story today here. The frame story for today's episode is going to be based around advanced persistent threats, or specifically nation state attacks that use media sources as one of their attack vectors. So we've talked about APTs before with David Balcar of Carbon Black and Alyssa Knight of Knight Inc. And we've had Eric Neelam of BlackBerry talking about his report on the cybercrime group Bahamut. So this is always an area of interest in the show, but tell me about the News Corp hack by Chinese cybercriminals and the way that attacks like these can be used not only to target media outlets and even not just journalists, but their in-country sources. I believe am I getting that right? You are, yeah.
And I think the kind of inherent in that is the need for journalists and in-country sources to communicate, right?
Yes,
to communicate however they can to get messages out. And, when you have things like the Great Firewall and others, like be very creative or maybe more vulnerable in order to get things out. So, and it often happens in email. I think increasingly you're seeing these in your Signal and some of your more secure apps, right? I think you have some of this movement to that specifically in an effort to combat the growing aggression, cyber and other to journalists globally, right? Because they do want sources, they do want new intel. So they're very open to a cold call potentially, right? Because this could be an amazing source. And in that openness, right, where, a lot of, I think, email security teams get to be like they can have a very high threshold for vetting or validating who's reaching out.
Right.
Journalists almost by design want to get, because this
door
could
has
be
to be wide open. Yeah.
And in fact, it aligns quite well with my old life where we're looking for intelligence sources, right? We're looking for assets. Some asset, writes into what have you and says, I may have intel around a terrorist threat or this leader or this thing. It would be, foolhardy not to follow up on it, but you also are exposing your own security resources, access in building that bridge, right? And that is, you could have a really heavy social engineering element to that, right? To what, what is a kind of dangle of a source, right? Yeah. That then turns into rapport building, that then turns into sharing of information, and then exposing and then leveraging for the attacker. I mean, it can be even though the approach seems almost dated in that it's a grift on the street or something,
That's still what works the best. Yeah.
It's, some of my best friends are humans. Other ones are dogs. Increasingly, they're dogs. But, we are fallible. And very often we're very social creatures, right? We are open to having a conversation. And those in line of work where you are talking about a journalist, this, that, it just is a natural thing for them. Yeah. So what they really need to be thinking about is, how can I have that level of exposure and engagement with the levels of protection and security I need in place to make sure that it's not taken advantage of, right? Yeah. And the biggest ones being multi-factor authentication, validation of being able to, and thankfully journalists are outstanding researchers. But let me, how can I vet and validate the individual? What questions can I ask that might, make their social engineering more complicated, right? And you shouldn't take things at face value. And usually, very often, right, that social engineering goes only so far until they start to have to fabricate and their story starts to unravel. Now, the more sophisticated actor, the more deep that fabrication can go. But,
right.
I would say going after your lying journalists, it's probably more of a standard playbook rather than a truly targeted, truly deep, and what we would call backstopped, approach where they have a Facebook account, that wasn't created a week ago. They have Twitter that actually follows and retweets, right? Yep. They actually have some level. I mean, you could start to dig into the level of
the depth of complexity,
right? In reality, but again, they have to take the time. So if it's something fast moving, and that's where they'll get you, right? If it's just something that is quick turnaround, immediate, and urgent.
It's also the sort of, it's the job where you're most closely connected to, you need to open this now or it could go away. I mean, we always talk about, the fact that social engineering sort of relies on you to make the decision before you've thought about it. And I suppose if you're looking for, and especially if you've been like hitting your head against a brick wall, right? When someone finally says, I have this information that you need, like, you're just going to, unless you stop yourself, you're just going to go, great. Thank goodness no one else has.
That's right. You can already see the Pulitzer Award. You could already, you're going to get that headline because there's that, right? They could be like, oh, I'll just send this to, sorry, Washington Post, if you're not going to respond to me, the Wall Street Journal is dying to post this. I mean, you don't know that, right? But if I can weave that web, you're like, no, I trust you. I do. Let's send me that link and I'll go right to the page, or we can engage that way. Because again, you are chasing a deadline to some extent.
Yeah. Now, I mean, you've mapped it pretty well here, but could you sort of walk me through some of these attack vectors? I mean, are journalists mostly getting these on their phone, through their Facebook, through their laptops? Like, is it a combination? Is there any particular pattern that you can see?
I think it is fairly mixed. I mean, email being the most common, right? Email in which you could get anywhere, right? Email, I think, is the most common. Anytime but I would say increasingly any of your SaaS applications or communications are going to be looked at, right? Or are going to be attempted in the password. I mean, I the most common and the consistent, this is true with so many of the cybersecurity, is going to be email. It's an easy route. Your email address is being put out there almost at the bottom of your byline or at your website. Contact me. I mean, there's
everywhere.
An open invitation, but that one, I almost want the journalists to make sure that they're viewing that almost as a spam folder, right? And not as like their trusted asset. And almost have phases, right? Okay. You emailed into this. I'm now going to move you into something that is more secure. Or I'm going to move you into something that has more security for me over time. But it usually involves clicking on a link or taking to a website that then might look very much like, oh, I just need to log back into my Microsoft Outlook account, right? And it looks, the number of times we've seen the pristine looking website. I mean, I think people almost have a dated, thought of like, well, it's going to be a website filled with spelling errors or context errors. It's like,
HTML 1.0. Yeah.
Right. That if you have that, then you have a bottom feeder, but you also have some that are going to be
very sophisticated.
Check that URL, reroute, go to the actual website, type in the URL that is correct to get to it, right? Because they're really doing a dual thing, right? One, they're account harvesting to use them and then use that password against all your other accounts. They're brute forcing, right? They're just throwing tons of accounts, tons of email passwords at your account. So using that classic personal cyber hygiene of complex and long passwords, using I think using a password vault, where you have those complex and you're not trying to remember anything. I think that is a growing best practice. Yeah. And certainly multi-factor authentication, right? You should have that on everything. If you don't, or if somebody that you're interacting with doesn't, you need to heighten your security because you're interacting with someone that isn't as high as you would like it. Yeah.
Now, is there kind of a steep learning curve with journalists that you're finding? Obviously there's, a couple are getting burned and facing terrible consequences, but do you think that the sort of journalistic community as a whole is sort of understanding the scope of this and hardening their defenses, or is this something that we're still trying to get the message out on?
So I think some of them have some of the best practice that I'm confident I could learn something from, right? Yeah. So I think those seasoned, those that have been in those types of situations before. But again, you're always going to have the person who's new to that beat, or there, you have this kind of turnover, right? Yeah. And I don't know. You don't have a sense for the level of mentoring or of, hey, let's talk about your
specifically security issues. Yeah. Right. Or whether your journalistic source even has a sort of policy on that sort of thing.
Right. I do know some companies that certainly are putting a premium on bringing on a head of security or a chief of security that isn't just about the security for their company, for themselves, but also how do you extend that and train up and get smart those journalists that are on the front line, right? And I think we've seen this really mature, I would have said, over the last 6 years. I think certainly many journalists felt during, and parking all politics here, but over the Trump presidency, where you might have, more left-wing journalists or more considered defined. I mean, the way that the media has been framed, right, as a potential adversary to certain elements, they by the, even from a kind of continental U.S. type of level of awareness and security has been heightened. I think that only translates that much more when you're talking about international actors.
Can you sort of, you said all the sort of pieces separately, but can you help me visualize what a truly secure journalistic source looks like? Let's say like a malicious thing comes in through your email or through your phone. Like what is it having to swim through before you get caught if you're securing it well? Like you said, 2-factor, you said, proper identification and stuff. What are some of the other sort of buffers that you can use to keep it out?
I mean, for the individual, I think that unfortunately, it comes into the email, and again, you're a journalist, so you want that email, you want that outreach. Let's assume it's not hard to fabricate that. I don't think that's hard to generate interest. Yeah, I'd say I'm checking for like trying to move me to links. Like if there's a link in there, why is it there? What's it associated with? Yep. Before I would click on it, absolutely, I would research the site. I mean, you could see the URL there. You could start to do some general research around that link. I mean, there really wouldn't be too much of a need outside of maybe I'm passing you, hey, I have this stack of documents, go to, this FTP site and just, log in there. If you need to log into a place you've never logged into before, definitely create that new password for it. Do not use a password you always use to remember it. Don't because that they're going to harvest that password you used, even though this is the first time you put it in that website. Yeah. If I get that, I'm going to use that at the top. Yeah. That's the top of my brute force. I'm going to start from there. I'm going to do iterations on that. Right. The AI and the capability for the computer to now brute force around some good indicators is only speeding up and increasing. So I would be careful of that. I would vet the individual, you know, whether that's asking them specific questions of where they claim to be, and they might not, I mean, they can be guarded, right? They can, hey, I can't tell you exactly where I am because this, you know, but you could ask easy questions like, oh, you're reporting to me from Russia. You know, what time is it there? Or what, you know, how's the weather or what's going on? I mean, you can weave in some of your own type of probing indicators, right? It kind of almost reverse social engineering, if you will, where you're kind of trying to catch them in there, because if they have to take, you know, 5 minutes to tell you the weather, right? They probably went and searched the weather, right?
Yes,
I mean,
right, exactly.
I could look outside and tell you in DC, you know, it is, you know, chillier today than it was yesterday. You know, I got a sweater. I mean, it is all of those things. Well, I think also, I'm sorry to. Go ahead. I'm sorry. No. I think the other is getting them on a FaceTime if you're comfortable with that, right? Because that very much is like, oh, wait a minute, what's going on? You could get aspects of their personality, of their location, just from their surroundings, right? If all of a sudden they come up with a lot of my camera doesn't work, I don't have a camera, I can't get that. I mean, all of a sudden they can fabricate, and again, they may be genuine, but if they have a lot of excuses for why they can't do things like that, again, be you know, ever heightening that sense of security awareness.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, what I was going to say was that I feel like for folks, you know, who are listening, who might have, you know, clicked on the free pizza coupon in their email and feel bad about it later, like these are the exact same techniques that are happening at all levels. I mean, there's, you know, the complexity may have increased a little bit, but at the heart of it, you still have that either that invoice or that link or that a desperate phone call to give me your information as quickly as possible and stuff like that. It's still all the sort of the same point of entry.
Yep. And I think the worst thing we could do is underestimate how sophisticated they can be. Right. And I think you do really need to trust your gut a bit. If something just seems weird, just do a little extra scrutiny, a little extra investigation. It's not ever a bad thing to do anyways. So if it just feels wrong, make sure, you know, get your level of confidence. That's right. That's right. Because I mean, the amount of social engineering or the amount of social media scraping and harvesting, you know, that can scale. I think truly targeted, tailored social engineering attacks years ago was cumbersome, was harder to do all the research and the work. Today, a lot of it can be automated, a lot of it with more NLP which only means they can scale better, which means they can just kind of go after many, where maybe historically you'd be too small a fish or too corner of the internet. Today, you know, the opportunity and the resource cost are such that they've kind of flipped.
Yeah. Now, and can you, I don't want to play worst case scenario here, but can you sort of explain, say a reporter or their source gets compromised, like how far up can that escalate in terms of damage? It can, you know, go straight into the news source, into government sources, like what's, you know, like at what point does, you know, is the limit reached, if any? Yeah.
And I mean, and certainly, journalists can have a very sensitive set of asset networks, right? Yes. That are placed in various, and on top of that, if they are government individuals that are sharing information, that information could then be used to blackmail that individual, right? Because they're probably not supposed to be talking to a journalist, but because they are, right? Right. So I think what journalists certainly can do is do the best they can to separate certain communications lines and channels to different areas, right? So, you know, this is like you don't have every single contact in one email mailing list in which, you know, someone got access to that. They can see every contact you have, right? I think wherever they can transition off of true name, that true location for someone that has been vetted and is kind of proven to be a core asset. Yep. You know, I think that's certainly too. And then, you know, how they could use it to to leverage your account. I mean, also be very mindful of what emails seem to be going out. Now, again, a good practitioner will use your password to get into your email, harvest what information they can, maybe then use an impersonation, a hijacking of your account to send an email, right? Mm-hmm. So now I'm doing that with a link to the target, and then I'm deleting the email in the outbox, right? So the way we certainly approach email security is all about some of that really awkward behavior in identifying and highly social engineering and impersonation attacks, because never sent this email. This email has never looked like this. This is an odd time for the individual. But all that context easily is lost when it's the human to human interaction. So, I do think they can escalate privileges. They can escalate their activity. They can just sit and watch. I think there's a number of different ways that they could, and stages perhaps, right? They're going to, once they're there, they can just watch and see the information that's coming in, evaluate it, maybe from an espionage standpoint, just use it. They can then choose, if there's not much value there, see if your account could be used to piggyback into another account, right? And kind of daisy chain from almost a communications supply chain attack rather than, because why not use you as a trusted, contact of Chris? Well, if I'm having trouble get Chris, if I can have the email come from Marcus, I'm already 3 steps into the kind of trust circle.
Trust sphere. Yeah. Okay. So have you take off your security awareness hat and put on your sort of threat research hat? Can you talk about some of the main security threats and threat actors that you're currently researching or dealing with? Are there particular trends, malware types, or threat actors that kind of keep you awake at night?
Sure. I mean, I am. The things that keep me up tonight are less non-state cyber actors and more, what's going to happen next in terms of Russia and Ukraine. Again, it's hard to talk about cyber when we kind of know what's happening on the ground and the crisis and everything. But I think it is important for us to recognize that I don't think the cyber chapter in this conflict has been yet to be written, and that does keep me up. The hacktivism, the non-state actors that are in there, also concerning in terms of they're in the mix of when, Russia chooses to reciprocate economic disruption and economic pressure on the U.S. and its allies. Critical infrastructure, obviously, of concern. I mean, one of my kind of, I'm still wrapping my head around it, but one of my biggest concerns is actually a event like Colonial Pipelines, but conducted against the Russians. So if a hacktivist group or non-state actor takes a vigilante, not USG, takes it upon themselves to see if they could do something to a Russian company that impacts Russian infrastructure, and all of a sudden you have Putin, who has maybe the justification to escalate. So a miscalculation that escalates the conflict, right? I think when you're thinking about, for those that are sitting at the computer and thinking about vigilante going at it, I mean, I know, be the defensive vigilante, help your local small and medium business.
There's plenty of work to be done that doesn't need to be
right. I mean, it's not like we don't have an A team of people that can attack, and they'll be factoring in all the pieces of intel and potential implications of an offensive action. So, that is probably one of the things that I worry most about, because it's really chaotic out there right now. And the number of people that are in the mix is really high
and unaccountable. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I want to kind of move from rip from the headlines to the sort of more career cyber work oriented part of the discussion. As we discussed previously, there's a lot of gradations and careers and jobs relating to things like threat research or threat intelligence, incident response, and so forth. So for folks who are interested in what you do and sort of from a threat research standpoint, can you talk about the types of skills, knowledge, experience, certifications, study, whatever that they should be looking into to make them desirable to people hiring this type of work?
Sure. And I think kind of the first thing you need is just a general interest, right? I don't want to say passion because that can get a little crazy where people are like, you have to be obsessed with it, cybersecurity, or you don't earn it on, if you don't wear it like a sleeve in a brand, then
you just have to know that you can't just get away with just hitting the button and letting the machine, you got to know why you're doing it, right?
That's right. And I think there are a number of different areas. I mean, honestly, I get a lot from the Infosec and cybersecurity discussions and threads that happen in your Twitter or your LinkedIn. Though there's great conversations. Yes, they take their natural Twitter odd right turn, and then you just kind of move on. But they, I think some of the most interesting and fastest breaking research and analysis that's happening is there that you can then kind of learn more from. I think a curated, kind of who you like. And you also, I think, are going to get a much better exposure to the diversity of backgrounds and diversity of people that are doing this through that space, right?
Absolutely.
I think no one wants to be in an echo chamber where you look and sound like everyone else around you, right?
And all the solutions are exactly coming from the same angle. And
that's right. That's exactly right. And I mean, and this is a little biased, I think I know we do a lot of our own blogs and we have great subject matter experts, and we try and, put that stuff out there as best. Yeah. I mean, we have great pen testers, former NCSC in the UK stuff, CIA folks, NSA folks, putting blogs out on threats we're seeing, trends we're seeing. We are trying to, I think, do more of that. I think, every company looks at it and goes, can we give more to the industry, right? So I think for us, we're putting out a little bit more around our AI research and some of the machine learning stuff, and maybe some more academic and putting more papers out there through our research center that are abstracts and academic or research approach in nature. I think that's very powerful. So I think we are not, no shortage of smart people doing really interesting things. So I think it's just start somewhere, and then it's going to take you kind of down different paths.
Natural curiosity is going to take you where you want to go anyway.
It's exactly right. And then for those that want to get deep technical, you can go that route and find those people. Those that want to stay strategic or some mix therein, you can do that. And I recommend trying to kind of almost gravitate between both, because I love to go, because every time I try and go technical, I can go a little further than I did before, right? Because it's like, I learned about that now, so it's don't sit here. Stretch yourself, and be open to all the good voices that are out there, sharing what they know. I think that by my sense of the Infosec, community is a lot of it is putting stuff out there, right? And sometimes it's negative, but which is always never a good thing for a conversation. And sometimes you do have those fakes that are out there, right? That aren't writing, but you'll sniff them out. They'll get the Infosec is a very good community to call out those that maybe are
not communicating in good faith.
Right. Or honestly. So it is a mixed bag. So you got to take it like that. But I find, there's a lot of good conversation that does happen out there.
So I asked this of a past guest, and this was specifically, as I said, someone who did the report on the Bahamut threat group. And I know that you're not necessarily as, closely identified with any particular cyber criminal or threat group, but I know maybe a lot of people would like to contribute to this industry, but who might reflexively be sort of wary about being so directly in the crosshairs of actual cyber criminals. I mean, can you talk about sort of safety measures or sort of adjacent, lines of work in this area that don't make you sort of public enemy number one, is whether it's threat modeling or incident response or other types of things?
Sure. And I think there are some that, especially when you're talking about those that are some of the first to do attacker attribution, right? That I think gets interest, right? Because, they want to, those APTs want to sit in the shadows. So if someone's done the good research to kind of call them out and be able to point to the reasons why, and then an FBI notice comes out or an action is taken to bring out that botnet, I think it is a real change in risk that you should be aware of, and not too different from what we mentioned around how journalists need to be worried about, right? I mean, as you get out there and talk about things, and what or what you don't know what you're doing, just be mindful of it, that it is, the word gets out, right? I mean, I'm not on the front lines of kind of the research. And so I talk about some of the strategies that I see and kind of speak to it from a analysis and facts as known type of approach, when those that are doing real, kind of groundbreaking research or things that, people haven't, I mean, that is, and usually those people, if they're able to do that research, they have that same sense of understanding how to protect themselves. Like they're savvy enough on both sides of that coin.
They know, and they also sort of know what they're getting into. Yeah.
Yes. And they're often very, very, sensitive to their own security. Like they tend to be those people that are in that basement without, everything goes to a PO box and then, but there's reason for that. So I think one is to don't fear monger or don't go too
don't assume that
Russia, I've said the word Russia. Now they're coming at me. And but the other is recognize that as you get into that discourse, your risk profile, right? In the company. I mean, luckily I work for a very good cybersecurity company. So I feel very good about what I have on my laptop and what I use and the distance I have between what I use here and what I use personally, and that is intentional. But I do think you're right. I mean, that it shouldn't prevent them from being out there kind of, especially when it's bringing light to actions of malicious or nefarious, or can benefit the broader community because we all get smarter from that research. But the other is when you do that, recognize that, you might have moved up to a different tier within a target deck that you need to be equally security mindful as well.
Yeah. And like I say, there's still so many things that you can do even if you're a little bit worried about that kind of thing. There's so many adjacent career moves around this field that where no one ever has to. You're never going to be in the crosshairs if you're if you're working help desk or a SOC analyst or whatever.
That's exactly right. I mean,
security analyst. So because we're always it's certainly well known that there's a lot more jobs looking for people, than there are people to do them in certain areas of cybersecurity. So if that's a worry, then don't worry about that. There's I'm not in the crosshairs, and and so aren't other people who do this kind of work.
Right.
Yeah. So as we wrap up today, Marcus, thank you for your time. By the way, this has been really fascinating. But could you tell our listeners about DarkTrace and some of the services you provide and what products or projects or activities you're excited to reveal in 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the big draw for me to come to DarkTrace, and we talked about novel emerging next generation technologies, but for me, it's actually how they're not only that it is an outstanding kind of using unsupervised learning and supervised learning in a way to really think about how one is approaching security, but it is one that moves away the optic from the attacker to the actual business, right? I look at and understand business normal to then defend business normal. So I can be threat agnostic. I can be, right? And for me, and it's, and again, it's all kind of digital ecosystem, whether it's in SaaS, we talked about email, certainly network, even industrial. But that idea of understanding normal to not only alert against abnormal, but also autonomously defend, right? At the same time is so critical. So that to me was the big kind of draw and pull in for DarkTrace. Some of the things that we've done on top of that really kind of are just a sweet spot for me is one, augmenting the human security team. How we're using AI to do autonomous investigation, autonomous triage to let the human get further, faster, and do more. The area where I'm really excited that we're headed in the next year is better thinking through attack path modeling, attack surface understanding. Can you have a proactive approach in understanding threat paths so you can now actually harden your environment before the attacker identifies? So can you make it so hard on the attacker because you really thought about the different ways that they might want to move within your environment and harden those areas that becomes very difficult for the attacker. So that's really exciting to me as another chapter to kind of where DarkTrace is looking.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So one last question for all the marbles here. If our listeners want to learn more about Marcus Fowler or DarkTrace, where should they go online?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active out there of things that I like or things that I point to or that I'm taking stuff from professionally, as well as I put out things, when things are out there. The other would be, going to darktrace.com. The website is fantastic. You can go to the blogs. You can see a lot of the really cool research and also how we're defending, right? You can get into the positioning and kind of the differentiators, but as well as like really that concept of moving from it's about breach or everything needs to be left of breach to actually being, it can be right of breach, but it needs to be left of business disruption.
Right.
Yes. Which is a really interesting space, right? Because then when you get past if, when, and get into active self-defense, active protection, business resilience. And that's really the problem we're all struggling with, not how to harden or deepen the perimeter wall.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right. Well, listeners, go check that out. See what's happening on the front lines of perimeter and interior work. Marcus, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a great chat. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's really been fantastic. I appreciate the conversation. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone that's listening to and supporting Cyberwork, the podcast. New episodes of Cyberwork are available every Monday at 1 p.m. Central, both on video at our YouTube page and on audio wherever you download your podcasts. And I wanted to make sure you all know that we have a lot more than weekly interviews in cybersecurity careers. You can also learn cybersecurity for free on the special section of our Infosec skills platform. Go to infosecinstitute.com/free, create your account. We have classes on cybersecurity foundations, cybersecurity leadership, digital forensics, incident response, DevSecOps, Python for cybersecurity, and that's just a fraction of it. So just go to infosecinstitute.com/free and start learning today. Thank you very much once again to Marcus Fowler and DarkTrace, and thank you all for watching and listening, and we will speak to you next week.